Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is being buried in a coffin, in their best clothes, with flowers on top and a headstone that will outlast everyone who remembers their name. You probably think that's just what humans do when someone dies. But that idea, that death deserves ceremony, that the body matters after the person is gone, that's not obvious. No other animal on Earth does this. And the strange part is, we've been doing it for so long that the first burials happened before humans even had language as we understand it. So the question isn't just what ancient humans believed happened after death. It's when a pile of bones stopped being garbage and started being someone. Let's go back further than you'd expect. In 2013, cavers in South Africa squeezed through a passage so narrow that only people built like a gymnast could fit. It's called the Rising Star Cave System, and 300 feet underground, in a chamber that has never been easy to reach, researchers found bones. Not a few, over 1,500 fossil fragments belonging to at least 15 individuals. The species is called Homo naledi, and here's the part that broke every assumption in the field. Homo naledi had a brain about a third the size of yours. By the old rulebook, a brain that small shouldn't produce anything close to ritual behavior. And yet the bodies weren't scattered by predators or washed in by a flood. They were placed there, deliberately, in a chamber that would have taken serious effort and risk to enter. Some researchers even found what looks like a deliberately marked wall nearby. Not everyone agrees on what it means, but if this holds up, it pushes the origin of "we don't just leave our dead lying around" back further than anyone expected, and further than language itself may go.
Now compare that to something we're far more certain about. Around 50,000 years ago, in a cave called Shanidar, in what's now Iraq, Neanderthals were burying their dead. One skeleton, known as Shanidar 4, was found with soil samples containing unusually high concentrations of pollen. For decades, the popular version of this story was that Neanderthals covered their dead in flowers, a grieving, tender act from a species most people assumed was just a brute. The flower theory has been challenged since. Some researchers think burrowing rodents may have dragged the pollen in. But here's what nobody disputes. The body itself was placed in a shallow pit, deliberately positioned, not discarded. Neanderthals were doing this at multiple sites across Europe and the Middle East. They weren't dumping bodies. They were putting them somewhere on purpose, over and over again. That raises an obvious question. Why bother? A body doesn't need protecting once the person is dead. It won't get cold, it won't get hungry. So why did a species with no writing, no permanent settlements, and by some estimates limited spoken language, start digging holes and placing their dead inside them with intention? The most likely answer isn't really about the dead, it's about the living. Once a group has spent years next to someone, has depended on them, fought beside them, raised children next to them, that absence doesn't just disappear because the heart stopped. Burial may have started as something closer to what we now call grief management, a way of processing loss, of drawing a line between this was someone and this is just a body now. Not a belief system yet, a behavior. The belief came later, layered on top. And once humans started doing this on purpose, the evidence gets a lot more specific about what they thought was actually happening. Around 100,000 years ago, at a site called Kafse in modern Israel, archaeologists found a burial of a child, arranged carefully, with a set of deer antlers placed directly against the chest. Antlers don't end up on a chest by accident. Someone placed them there, after the body was already positioned, which means someone made a decision about what the dead needed to be sent off with. That's not just disposal anymore. That's preparation for something. Move forward to around 34,000 years ago. For scale, a single bead like that could take close to an hour to carve using stone tools. That means these two burials alone represent tens of thousands of hours of labor. Alongside the beads, spears made of straightened mammoth tusk, an object so difficult to produce that experimental archaeologists have spent months failing to replicate the technique. These children were buried with more wealth, more labor, and more craftsmanship than most adults in that community would have owned in their entire lives. Why would a hunter-gatherer group, people who had to carry everything they owned on foot, bury tens of thousands of hours of work in the ground with two children? Because in their minds, that work wasn't being wasted. It was being sent somewhere. This is where the archaeology starts pointing at something bigger than grief. It's pointing at belief. If you thought death was simply the end, an off switch, there'd be no reason to send someone into the ground wearing beads, holding weapons, surrounded by tools. You bury those things with a body because some part of you believes the person still needs them, somewhere, in some form. Around this same period, humans start using red ochre in burials constantly. Ochre is a naturally occurring iron-rich pigment, and when you grind it up, it produces a deep red powder, close to the color of blood. Across dozens of sites, from Africa to Europe to Australia, archaeologists keep finding bodies stained or covered in it. At a site in Australia called Lake Mungo, a body dated to around 42,000 years old was found completely covered in red ochre, the earliest known example of ritual cremation and ochre burial on that continent. This wasn't a one-off. This was a pattern repeating itself across completely disconnected human populations who had no contact with each other. When you see the same specific behavior show up independently on different continents thousands of years apart, that's usually a sign you're looking at something built into how humans think, not something one group invented and passed around.
So what were they actually trying to do with the ochre? Nobody can prove it with certainty, but the leading theory connects directly to what the color represents. Blood means life. Red means alive. Covering a body in red may have been an attempt to symbolically return life to it, or to mark it as something that hadn't fully left the world of the living. Whether they believed the color helped the person on some kind of journey, or protected the living from whatever the dead had become, the point is the same. Color was being used as a message, and a message only makes sense if you believe someone or something is meant to receive it. By around 40,000 years ago, we get a different kind of evidence entirely: cave art. Deep inside caves like Chauvet in France, humans crawl through total darkness carrying fire, past any point a curious animal would bother going, to paint on walls no one lived near. Horses, lions, rhinos, painted with a level of skill that looks almost impossible for the time period. These weren't decorations for a home. Nobody lived in that section of the cave. So why go that deep to paint something nobody would casually see? One leading theory is that these deep chambers functioned as something closer to a threshold, a place between the world of the living and whatever came after it. Some anthropologists studying cave art alongside modern hunter-gatherer cultures have pointed to shamanistic practices, altered states achieved through rhythm, isolation, or ritual, used to symbolically travel to another realm and bring something back. Painting an animal wasn't just art. It may have been an attempt to capture or communicate with a spirit, in a space specifically chosen because it felt separate from ordinary life. Put burial, ochre, and cave art together, and a shape starts to form. Ancient humans increasingly treated death not as a wall, but as a doorway, something continued, somewhere in some form, that required preparation and possibly required belief in an audience on the other side. By the time we reach the Neolithic period, around 10,000 years ago, this idea stops being symbolic and starts becoming architectural. At a site called Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey, one of the earliest large settlements ever found, people buried their dead directly underneath the floors of their homes, not in a separate graveyard, under the exact spot where they cooked, slept, and lived every day. Some skulls were even removed after burial, plastered and painted to resemble a living face, then kept and displayed. Living with your ancestors wasn't a metaphor to these people. It was literal, physical, everyday reality. The dead weren't gone. They were still part of the household. And then, around 4,500 years ago, that idea reaches its most extreme form in ancient Egypt. Entire lifetimes were spent preparing for death. Bodies were mummified, organs preserved in canopic jars, tombs built and stocked with food, furniture, boats, even servants, real or symbolic, because the belief was that the afterlife wasn't some vague concept. It was a continuation of this life, and you'd need supplies to get there and live well once you arrived. The pyramids themselves are essentially the most expensive afterlife insurance policy ever constructed, an entire civilization organizing its economy, labor, and religion around the idea that death was not an ending, but a transition that required serious logistical planning.
So here's the full picture. Roughly 300,000 years ago, or maybe even earlier if Homo naledi holds up, humans started treating dead bodies differently than every other species on the planet. Not discarding them, placing them. By 100,000 years ago, they were sending the dead off with objects, meaning they believed something about the dead still needed things. By 40,000 years ago, they were painting red ochre onto bodies to mark them, and crawling into the deepest, darkest parts of caves to paint animals no one would casually see. By 10,000 years ago, they were living directly on top of their ancestors' graves, keeping the dead physically present in daily life. And by 4,500 years ago, an entire civilization was built around the idea that death was simply the next chapter, one you needed to prepare for with the same seriousness as anything in this life. None of these people had the same religion. Most of them never had any contact with each other at all. But independently, over and over, across tens of thousands of years, on different continents, humans kept arriving at the same conclusion. This can't just be it. And whether that belief came from grief, from fear, from the simple, unbearable weight of watching someone who was there yesterday not be there today, it shaped almost everything that came after it. Religion, architecture, art, ritual, the entire concept of an afterlife. All of it traces back to a hole in the ground, a body placed with intention, and a species that has never, not once, been able to accept that death is simply nothing. If you want to dig deeper into any of this, all the research is linked down in the description.